All right, it looks like we are live. So welcome. It's great to have you with us. This video. We're going to take a look at the Legacy Standard Bible, which is this is very little. I'll talk about this in just a moment. But the Legacy Standard Bible is a new English translation, and you could argue it's not really new. We'll talk about that as well. We're going to talk about what the Legacy Standard Bible is, where it comes from, what's distinctive about it, and we're going to take a look at it compared to both the New American Standard Translation, the old one from the 1995, and also we're going to take a look at it with regards to the Greek text of the New Testament as well. So that's what we're going to spend our time on today. My name is Daryl Burling, in case you're interested. I run and started and organize a membership site called Master New Testament Greek, and each week here on this YouTube channel, I have a video that I normally release talking about something to do with the Greek New Testament, and so this is part of that channel. So if you're interested in more about that, if you want to get the clarity, the confidence, and the efficiency that comes from being able to work directly in the text of the New Testament, then go ahead and hit the subscribe button and the notify bell. And if you find this video helpful, hit the like button. That's really helpful as well. So having said that, let me just ask, as we start our time together, let me just ask you what translation you use. Leave a note in the comments just below and let me know. I'm keen to hear whether you're using the New American Standard or something else for your English translation as well. And I suspect that there's a number of you who don't use English translations very often now, and you're really more Greek in the New Testament, perhaps English in the Old Testament. Just let me know in the comments below what you are using. That would be fantastic. Now, let's just make a start here by just talking. I just want to make a quick note about my relationship to the Legacy Standard Bible. I haven't been involved in this at all. I did study at the Master's Seminary. I did my Master of Divinity there. And in fact, I know some of the men who were involved in the translation committee here. I know them personally. I know they are godly men who love the Lord and love His Word and are seeking to honor Him with their attempts to serve Him through this translation. So it's a great little... I really appreciate the men who are on this, and the purpose of this, then, just to be clear, is not to tear apart the translation. That's not my goal. It's really just to take a look at it. With every translation, there's always things that they have to look at, they have to change. There's going to be compromises they have to make, because it's just really hard to make a good English translation and to make it represent the original language in any real representative kind of way. So it's a hard job to do, and you can never do it perfectly. But I think there's some really good distinctives about this that we'll talk about as we go through. So having said that, let's talk briefly about a history of the Legacy Standard Bible. And I don't know if you know this, but most English translations we have today are actually not original translations. They actually start with another text already in existence, and then they update it. Now, this is not unique to the Legacy Standard Bible. The ESV, for instance, the ESV really takes as its base the New Revised Standard Version. The New Revised Standard, of course, goes from the Revised Standard Version. The Revised Standard Version is, in fact, a revision of the King James. And so the Legacy Standard Bible fits in that same kind of path as well. Now, not every English translation is like that. For instance, the New International Version, the NIV, was an original translation from scratch without resting on the King James Version at all. But the Legacy Standard Bible sits in that King James stream as well. So essentially, the Legacy Standard Bible goes back to the New American Standard Bible from 1995, which is itself a revision of a 1977 revision of a 1971 revision or translation of the New American Standard. So 1971, the full New American Standard Version came out. 1977, there was a revision for it. 1995, there was another one. And then we get to the Legacy Standard Bible 25 years later. And of course, the New American Standard Version was a revision itself of the American Standard Version of 1901, which then goes back to the King James, which itself actually goes back to the Bishop's Bible, and that goes back to William Tyndale's 1536 translation, which was really the oldest complete translation we have of the Bible into English. So there's a long history here of translations going backwards to previous translations to build on the work that's been done by other men. And the legacy is exactly the same in that sense. And what happened was a little bit ago, so legacy is translated by the team at the Master's Seminary, which is what I mentioned before. And John MacArthur, who was until recently the president of the Master's Seminary, he's always been a huge fan of the New American Standard Bible. And in fact, let me tell you just a little bit about my background as well with the New American Standard, because it was my translation of choice for years as well. I became a Christian back in 1990, and I became a Christian reading the New International Version. And then a few years later, I was kind of struggling with some text, and about 1992, 93, somewhere around there, I decided to try another translation, picked up this one called the New American Standard, and it was like, wow, this is so much clearer. I found it a lot clearer than the NIV anyway, and so that really started me down this track. And so that's where it all started from with me. And John MacArthur has always been a fan of the New American Standard as well. He's had people in the seminary there who were involved in the original translations, to the New American Standard. And so he's used this for a long time because it is quite a literal translation. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. And when it became known that the Lockman Foundation was going to update the New American Standard to a more modern, updated translation of it, he actually went ahead and I think it was either he asked or they offered for him to be able to make his own fork, if you like, or branch, for those of you who have a little bit of a programming background, branch of the New American Standard, and that's where the Legacy Standard Bible comes from. So the Lockman Foundation gave the Master's Seminary the right to be able to create their own translation based on the New American Standard. So that's where it all comes from, and that's a bit of the history. And so it's been a couple of years in the making so far, and in fact, as it stands today, this is the New Testament with Psalms and Proverbs. The Old Testament hasn't been published yet, and it may not even be completed. I'm not 100% sure on the status of it. So you can go ahead and buy the New Testament in physical form, and this is the physical form of it. It's quite a cute little piece of, it's quite a cute little book. It's very small. I don't know if you can see that. Let me just see if I can. There we go. It's quite small. It's a nice leather-bound edition. The text inside is kind of small as well. You can see that. But it is quite a nice edition. It's nicely bound. It does it's pretty, for a small Bible, to have it to kind of lay flat out of the box is pretty decent. So I really like this. The pages inside, the paper is pretty nice. I'm not a Stephen Hackett or Grant Osborne, I think it is, one of those guys who is analyzing paper and font sizes. That's not really my thing, but the paper inside it is pretty opaque. It's pretty nice. You can see there's not a lot of bleed through there and behind that, just a touch, but it's pretty decent, which is nice. And so, yeah. And this has also got, in the back, it's got the Psalms and Proverbs, so you can go ahead and look through those as well, which does give you a little bit of a flavor of what it's like in those texts. Now, if you don't have a copy of this, because it is kind of hard to get, and this cost me more than it should have to get it here in New Zealand, but nonetheless, if you do want to get a copy, you can actually get a copy for free if you go into the App Store and you download it for your mobile device, be it for your iPad or your iPhone or Android device. If you go in there and just search for Legacy Standard Bible. In fact, let me just flick over here and I'll show you that. Where are we here? This is in my web browser, and you can just do a search. This is the logo that you'll be looking for here. You're looking for really this logo that indicates this is the Legacy Standard Bible, and it's actually produced by Accordance. So Accordance has partnered with the team there to bring the Legacy Standard Bible into a mobile app for free. Doesn't cost you anything to do that. And the nice thing about that is that if you have Logos Bible software and you go and download this and log into your Accordance, let me rephrase that. If you have Accordance Bible software and you download the app and you go ahead and you log into your Accordance account, then when you go over to your Accordance Bible software, the Legacy Standard Bible will be added there as well. So this is a pretty cool feature, and it's quite nice. So we're going to be looking at it from, I'm not going to be taking you through the physical copy today. I'm going to be working from Accordance Bible software in here as well. So that's a little bit about the background of it. Let's talk a little bit about the translation philosophy behind the Legacy Standard Bible. And again, to do this, I'm going to just flick back to the web browser here. And what I want to do is we're going to go to the main page here. And you can see the page just in the bottom corner there that we're looking at. We're looking at lsbible.org/preface. This is or preface. This is the preface for the Legacy Standard Bible. And as we scroll down here, you can see that we have our principles of translation. So this is where we're going to spend a little bit of time here. I just want to point out a number of things here. This piece here is really the critical thing that I want to focus on for just a few moments. Consistently, the goal of this translation is to be a window into the original text. Within that goal, this revision has focused on accuracy and consistency. So this is a really important point. This is really where a literal translation will differ a little bit from some of the more free translations. Some of the more free translations are really trying to bring into English the meaning of the original language, whereas a more literal translation is trying to give you like that clarity about what's actually behind the text of the English translation. So there's a kind of a different approach there. And it's not to say that there's one is better than the other, and linguists here would probably argue a little bit here to say, well, a translation that conveys the original meaning is better than one that is more literal, and you can make that argument, and I'm okay with that. For what it's worth, my family, they tend to use the Holman Christian Standard Bible, which I'll talk about a little bit in this video as well. And that's a very good translation, and it's a little bit more free in a lot of ways, but it's still a very literal translation as well. Whereas this translation is intended to be a window into the original, right? So it's trying to give you clarity about what the text behind the English is actually saying, which has got some pros and cons. On the one hand, it's going to lead to a little bit more of a wooden translation. And this is one of the critiques of the New American Standard for a long time, is that it's got this more critique, more literal kind of and wooden translation, and it's much more difficult to read. And that's a fair problem, a fair comment with regards to that. But on the other hand, when you do use a Greek New Testament, when you do translate it and you do have a more of a flexible approach to the translation, then often it's less clear because you have to make compromises by translating and thereby interpreting what something might mean. And we're going to see a couple of examples as we go through a little bit later on of how we see this being modified a little bit inside of this translation as well. So that's one thing that they're trying to do, and this is really important. And so when it comes to what the Legacy Standard Bible is trying to do, there's a number of things that they point out here as well. So there are limits to the application of this philosophy as well. So for instance, here we have modern English usage. So one of the things that they're trying to do here is that there are some words that we don't use very often in English that what we used to use a lot, but now we don't. And so they've changed some of those usages, and we'll talk about some of those in just a minute. We've also find that there's, we'll talk about literal renderings and alternate renderings and so on a little bit. But there's a few other things here too. Theological consistency is one of them. And one of the things that they really want to do here is with the names of God. You know, in the Old Testament, God specifically says in Exodus chapter 3, "This is my name by which you will know me, Yahweh." And so what we have in just about every English translation is we will translate that as Lord, all caps, rather than actually putting Yahweh in there. And so what they're trying to do here, part of what they're trying to do is actually to bring that usage of God's name that he gave to us into English. And it's not that this was inconsistent with older the church fathers and things. In fact, they make this point down here that this is actually how a lot of the older church fathers would refer to Yahweh in the Old Testament particularly. And so it's interesting that when we look back on English translations, the Holman Christian Standard Bible did this. So it came out, and in fact, a number of the changes we see in the Legacy, we also see in the Holman Christian Standard Bible, which interestingly, when the Christian Standard Bible came out and replaced the Holman Christian Standard Bible and updated it, we see a lot of these things go away. So this is one of those things as well. So this is one of the things I've tried to do though. When it comes to the New Testament, they haven't put Yahweh in replacement of Kurios. They've maintained the New Testament text. If it says Kurios in the New Testament, then they're going to maintain Lord, the Greek translation of Kurios there as well. And there's a couple of other things as well. Terminology of slave. Again, the Holman Christian Standard Bible was very good and very consistent at translating the Greek word for doulos as slave. Here it is here. But again, the Christian Standard Bible did away with that again. So it's really interesting. Again, now here we have the Legacy Standard Bible bringing this back out as well. And we'll see some examples of this. Just very briefly, we'll take a look at it. Now, if you're getting value out of this, let me just ask to go ahead and hit the like button on this video. That's really helpful to helping this video get found. So go ahead and do that. And what I want to do in the next little bit, I want to move into some of the passages that we've been talking about with regards to particularly some of the passages that I've found really interesting as I've been looking through this translation. We're going to see some of the things we've just been talking about, but I also want to go through a number of things that just observations and modernizations and updates. So we'll do that now. We'll cross over to Accordance Bible software and we'll start by taking a look there as well. All right, so here we are in Titus, and this is where I want to just start. And the reason I want to start here, and what you can see here with Accordance Bible software, is that I've set it up here so that you can see on the left we've got the Nestle Aland 28th edition. In the middle we've got the Legacy Standard Bible, and in the right here, I guess that's the right, it will be the New American Standard, the 1995 update, which is what the Legacy has been moved on from. And I've turned on text comparison so you can see very easily where the Legacy makes changes and where it doesn't. And so the blue underlines are words that are added, or the words that are in one that are not in the other. The reds are to indicate where words have dropped out. Okay, so that's what we're looking at, and hopefully the text is big enough. I'm pretty confident it should be. So this is a good passage because what we see here, let me just flick over to Accordance myself, that would be really helpful. What we see here is that this is that use of Paul, a slave of God. And so we see in the Legacy Standard Bible very clearly, doulos here translated as slave, whereas in the New American Standard, we have Paul, a bondservant of God. Okay, so this is very clearly, this is one of those main changes that we talked about earlier on, and we can see it sort of coming into effect here pretty easily. Now, in terms of theological consistency, one of the ones that I really wanted to point out or talk about was in Galatians. So in Galatians chapter 3, verse 16, particularly, we have here this verse, and the Legacy Standard Bible here says, "Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed." Now this is important. So here we have, in the first half, we have seed very clearly. Now, in the next sentence, and he does not say, "and to seeds," referring to many, but rather to one. Now, it's interesting that if you were to look at the new, I think if we, in fact, let me just add in here the ESV, just for the fun of it here, and to your offspring. Notice how the ESV translates this as offspring rather than as seeds. Now the problem with that, of course, is that seed is actually a theologically loaded term from the Old Testament. And so if we take the word seed and drop it out and replace it with offspring, we end up thinking about genealogy and not actually about that theological thread that's woven throughout the Old Testament, starting really from Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. And so in the desire to maintain this theological consistency through the Old and New Testaments, what we see here is that the translators of the Lexham, I'm going to say that a lot. I keep looking at Legacy and keep thinking with the L, it's Lexham. Don't ask me why. I guess I spend too much time with Logos Bible software and Lexham materials. But nonetheless, it's the Legacy, right? So the translators of the Legacy have decided rather than to translate it as offspring, they wanted to use seeds, just like the New American Standard does. Now, where this becomes a little more interesting, at least in my mind, is that by the time we get to the end of this chapter, look at this, in the New American Standard here, "And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's descendants, is according to promise." So what we see here in this passage in the New American Standard is inconsistency in the way seed is translated. In verse 16, it was translated as seed correctly because the translators understood that this was that theological thread But here in verse 29, they've lost that a little bit, lost track of the argument, if you like. And if you're in English, you will also lose track of the argument following the New American Standard. But of course, in the Legacy, they've managed to keep this, recognizing that then this is, you are Abraham's seed. And if you were to ask me why this is one of the passages that I looked at in a little bit of depth when I was doing my doctoral studies. What we have here, I think, one of the reasons at least why this was not correctly caught here, I think it's easy when you're in a translation committee to get sort of stuck in the discussions about a particular verse rather than seeing that verse in the larger context. And this is the same thing you find with exegesis as well. You're picking things apart, and often the picking that part of details, you lose sight of the author's argument, and therefore you lose some of the connections within the text. And this is really one of the real blessings of being able to read the New Testament in its original language, is you start to see some of these words being reused. This is a really good case for this is in Hebrews 6, for instance, which is one of those highly debated passages. But when you look at it in Greek and you follow the usage of words throughout Hebrews chapters 1 through 6, you see some of the same words being used in chapter 6. And then if you know how they've been used previously, it helps that passage become a lot clearer. But here you can see that they've lost track of the argument essentially, and they've translated it descendants rather than seed. And that means, and what the problem here is that this is a really important text around union with Christ. Now, if you are of Christ. Now look at the Greek here is a genitive, and most of them are translating this. Most English translations, like the Legacy here, will translate it as a genitive of possession. But this could actually be a genitive of relationship. If you are a son of Christ, or if you are in Christ even. If you are, so there's a relationship. And part of the idea of union with Christ is it's a relational unity. And so that's, I think, part of what Paul is getting at here. And therefore, if you are in Christ, right, if you are of Christ, then you are the seed of Abraham. Just as back in chapter 3, verse 16, Jesus is the seed. If you are in Christ, you also are the seed, which means that all that seed Christ has also belongs to you, including the inheritance that was promised to Abram, which is the whole point here in this text. So this is a really significant change. It's not significant because most other English translations will have it consistently through here. However, the New American Standard had this wrong, and it was not so helpful. So that's another change that I've noticed here, and this is an indication of that desire for them to be theologically consistent throughout. And so this is, I think, a really solid improvement as well. Let's turn to another passage. I want to look at 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10. And this really speaks more to the use of text criticism inside the Legacy Standard Bible. So text criticism is one of these areas that's very, very difficult to please everybody on. So here in chapter 10, the key thing I want to look at here is really this phrase here. And in fact, it's really just these last two words. You'll see here in the Nestle Aland, we've got these indicators here to indicate that there is variations available here. In fact, if we pull these up, pull the bottom up here, you'll be able to see down the bottom there. I'm not sure that that's very large. Let me make that a bit bigger. There we go. So you can see down the bottom there that the text here, if you can read text criticism, though the first one there, the euristhesetai, that it will be found, that is a really well attested text. Now, this is a very highly debated. If you look at this in the UBS, I believe this is a C or a D rating. So there's a lot of uncertainty about how this is going to be rendered. And so in this case, the New American Standard takes it doesn't have the negation. It will be found out. The earth and its works will be found out. Whereas the New American Standard actually goes with the King James, which uses a totally different word. And if you look again at the bottom there, at the critical notes, you'll see the last two entries there, katakeisetai and katakeiesontai. Both of those are referring to either will be burned, it will be burned, or they will be burned, depending on whether you've got a singular or a plural there. So that's really the two editions that the King James and the New American Standard rest on, and they're not that well supported. It's better. The better support here is for eurythesetai or eurythesetai luomina, right? Either of those two is better supported, and then there's that variant with the negation of that as well, which the critical text here has taken. For what it's worth, the Lexham here is actually following, and taking this, is actually following the Tyndale Greek New Testament, which has eurythesetai without ook before it. And so this is an example where the Legacy Standard Bible has differed from both the critical text, the Nestle Aland text, following the Tyndale Greek New Testament, which I think in this case has a better approach to this particular passage than some of the other texts available. So that's just an example of how text critical notes actually make a difference here in the translation as well. So let me go back on to Luke 22, and this is where I just wanted to look at some of the changes generally that we see as we go through here. This one here in verse 21 here is one I wanted to start with. It says here, "But behold, the hand of the one betraying me is with me on the table." Now, this is interesting because the hand of the one is with me. The one betraying me, so if you look at the Greek text, the hand is very clearly the subject of the main verb here. The one betraying me then is really functioning as an adjective. And so here you have the hand of the one betraying me is with mine in the New American Standard, indicating clearly the hand. But here in the Lexham, here I did it again, in the Legacy, it seems to be indicate the one betraying me is with me. So the one betraying me then sort of seems to be carrying the text here more than the hand. Okay, so it looks to me in this case that they've almost changed the subject of the main verb from the hand to the one betraying me, which is clearly subordinate to heikir in this case. So that's interesting. Down here, what else have we got here? Let's go down to verse 45. There's another one I noticed here as well. One of the other changes we see with the Legacy, I just about got it wrong again, the Legacy Standard Bible here, is they do tend to, when you get kai at the beginning of a sentence, they do tend to translate that into English, which other translations wouldn't do. Now, part of the reason for this is that in the early manuscripts and in ancient writings, it didn't have punctuation. And so in order to bring out distinctions in terms of thought progression and new ideas, what they would do is they would often use conjunctions, joining words that would join sentence to sentence. And so we don't normally do this. So we would consider it today to be bad grammar to start a sentence with and. Now, they don't do this with day, which is probably the more common one. Like down here in verse 45, you can see here that day is regarded as a... oops, that's not what I was wanting to do. And let me just get rid of this as well. You can see down here in verse 45, day here is translated with the adversative but, both in the Legacy, there it is, Legacy Standard Bible, and in the New American Standard as well. But for the most part, if it's not contrastive, if day is not contrastive, then they've just not translated it. And that's the standard way that translators would treat day. But when they come across kai, they consistently, at least as far as I've been able to tell, they add it into the text, which means then you've got an and when he rose from prayer, rather than just when he rose from prayer, which means that the verse here then, the text in the Legacy, allows that connection to take place at a discourse level rather than by just using punctuation. So this is kind of interesting, and you'll see this consistently with the Legacy as well. Moving down this verse a little bit further to verse 62, here we see an instance where we're replacing archaic terminology or older words that we don't really use very often, and we're replacing these more with newer words. So here, the New American Standard, he went out and he wept bitterly, and the Legacy translates it, and he went out and he cried bitterly. Now, whether you think of these things as the same, or whether you would regard weeping as a quieter form of crying, those kinds of distinctions are kind of English distinctions in a lot of ways. The Greek word is the same regardless. He was, in fact, if we look at this as to weep or to cry as the gloss we get at the bottom there. So this is really just a change in English. And I think if you're used to reading wept, this is going to stand out to you. It did to me, which is one of the reasons why I noticed this. But you see this again very consistently. And again, the idea here, I think when you get changes like this, what you're seeing is really, it's going to grab you more because this is not a word you're used to seeing, and so hopefully it's going to stand out to you a little bit more. And whenever you get something in the text that's going to make you think more deeply about what you're reading, in my mind, that's always a good thing. And that, in fact, that's one of the benefits if you don't read Greek. If you are going from English translations, this is one of the good reasons really to read multiple translations, because they will sometimes put things differently, which is going to cause you to ask questions and then think more deeply about the text. What else have we got? There's a couple of other things I wanted to point out here in Luke as well. Verse 70. We're going to talk about verbal aspect in just a moment as well. Also, if you want me to take a look at a particular verse, I will take a look at a handful before we go. So go ahead and put those in the comments below, and I'll take a look at one or two of those as well, and we'll compare them to see what's taking place. But here in verse 70, this is really interesting. So, here's the New American Standard, and they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "Yes, I am." Okay, very interesting. Just a simple affirmation, yes, I am. But if we look at the text here, and to them he said, "You yourselves say that I am," which is exactly what we see here. And what's going on here is we have our pronoun, and this is an intensive use of the pronoun because in Greek, as you probably know, we actually have person and number in the verb form as well. So legete is a second person plural, so you don't actually need humes here to make sure that the person reading this understands that this says you say. In fact, you could leave humes off and say, "You say that I am," but by putting the humes in there, it makes it emphatic, it adds a little degree of emphasis. Now, most translations wouldn't translate that intensity when you're looking at it in Greek because it seems a little bit redundant. But here, they have. And I think it kind of has some significance in this particular instance. And I think it's a far better rendering than what we see here in the New American Standard, where it's just a simple affirmation. In fact, you could say that what they're saying, the New American Standard is really just leaving this out, right? There's no hoti, there's no humes legate, it's just ego eimi, I am, right? That's all they're saying. So the legacy here, I think, has done us a service by putting in, making this a little bit clearer and making it a little bit more explicit to what the Greek text has done. And so again, this is one of those cases where they've done a good job, I think, of helping us to see the text behind the English translation. And again, if you're finding this helpful, hit the like button on this video, and that helps it get found and helps other people to be able to see this and find it as well. All right, one more I want to look at, and then if there's anything in the comments, I will look at those as well. So let's go through the last one here I have, which is Luke chapter 23, verse 23. And here, this is really where we see a difference in the use of the imperfective tense form. So one of the big arguments and discussions that really takes place amongst scholars today, and we've talked about this on the channel before, is with verbal aspect. Now, verbal aspect is really the study of how is the author of the Greek text wanting to portray a verbal idea. Now, there's two primary, and there are some argue there's a third, but two primary tense or verbal aspects, right? There's the imperfective verbal aspect, which represents a Greek verb as being continuous. It looks at the verb from the internal point of view as it's unfolding. So it's almost like it draws you into the event so that you can kind of see the action taking place. It's almost like putting it into slow motion so you're watching it unfold. It's really quite a vivid way of writing the text, and it's quite arresting when you read it in Greek because it draws you into the story. The other tense form that we find a lot is the perfective tense form. The perfective tense form is really the default tense form in a lot of ways, and what this does is it just looks at the event from the outside. So let me give you a couple of analogies. Let's say you're looking at a parade. This is one that Constantine Campbell uses in his book, Verbal Aspect. What's it called? Basics of Verbal Aspect, I think it's called, by Zondervan. I'll leave a link to the description after I finish the video here. But what he talks about is with this parade, the imperfective tense form is kind of like being on the side of the road watching the parade as it proceeds past you. On the other side, the perfective aspect is more like being in a helicopter and seeing the parade as it kind of walks down through the streets, right? One of them is looking at the parade as a whole. The other one is there watching it kind of unfold. That's the imperfective aspect. And the perfective aspect is seeing it as a whole. Another way of thinking about it is if I was to give you an English sentence. So we sometimes use this variation in English as well. So if I was to say to you, yesterday I went to the store and I bought a soda. Right? That would all be in the perfective aspect. I'm telling you just what I did. I went to the store, past tense, completed action, and I bought, past tense, completed action, a soda. Okay? Now, if I was to put that into the imperfective, it would draw you into the story. And it would be like this. Yesterday, I was going into the store and I see there a soda, and I purchased this soda. And you can see now you're waiting for me to carry on and to tell you more about it. And this is what verbal aspect does as well. It draws you into the story, or it just summarizes the main events, depending on what the author is wanting to do. Now, for translations, this has not really been something that translators of English have spent a lot of time on. In the New American Standard, they did a little bit of this with the historical present. So the present tense, which is an imperfective tense form, in the past, they would say, and Jesus said, and they'd put a star next to that, and then they'd say, literally, says. And that star, well, they wouldn't necessarily have a note, but the star was there to indicate that this was an imperfective tense form and could be translated, and Jesus says, or Jesus goes. Okay, and the idea of that, again, in the Greek is to draw you into the story so that you're able to sort of really feel what's going on and, not so much be summarized as the perfective tense form would typically do. So that's just a brief overview of verbal aspect. Let's take a look then at how the Legacy Standard Bible approaches this. Now, if we go back to our original preface here, and let me just find that on my screen because what I'm looking at and what you're looking at is not necessarily the same thing. We'll come down here, Hebrew tenses aspect and stem Greek text. Here we go, Greek tenses moods. So here's what they've done. Typically, if it's an imperfective tense form, or an imperfect tense in this case, they render it either as an English past progressive, he was doing, or as inceptive, he began to do. Okay, so there's two ways with the imperfect particularly, and the aorist gets this a little bit as well. Something that can be started using one of these two tense forms. Okay, so this is really interesting, and there are times, and we'll see this in just a moment, where they've changed it from what the New American Standard has had, and they've put it slightly differently. And I think these are really interesting. I'm not sure that I would agree with all of these, but nonetheless, I think it's kind of very interesting for us to take a look at. So let's go over to accordance then, and we'll see what we see in accordance. Now, here in verse 23, here what we have is, well, the translation here for this one, but they were insistent, they were really literally, they were laying it upon with great voices, asking him to be crucified, right? Asking with regards to Jesus, reference, that's an accusative of reference, to be crucified, and they were prevailing, right? The voices of them, they were prevailing. So this is, again, here we have, you can see down the bottom here, this is a imperfect tense form. And look at how the New American Standard translates this. And their voices began to prevail. So they're taking that really there as they're taking that as an inceptive imperfect. So this is indicating then the beginning of an event. And you can see that from the italics around began. Began is in the italics to indicate that this is a decision the translators have made to indicate that this is something that began but wasn't necessarily completed in that moment. And that's obviously one of the uses of the imperfect tense form. Now, when you come to the legacy, they just render it as a simple progressive past tense verb. Okay, so they were prevailing. Now, this is an interesting decision, and I would probably, in this case, tend to back the New American Standard here because prevail has this idea of actually coming about, right? There's an outcome where something ends up happening. And so from the lexeme itself, I would tend to favor they began to prevail over were prevailing. But nonetheless, it's not a big issue, and it doesn't change the meaning of the text in any significant way. You're not going to draw different theology from this, but it is going to help you to read the text again and ask different questions. So we're going to look at, so as we see some of the uses here, we see some variations, but we do see them making a concerted effort to bring out the text of the Greek and the verbal aspect there in a way that you don't always see, at least not as consistently, perhaps, in some of the other English translations. And I think this is a very good thing. So I see there's a couple of comments there. Thank you all for your comments. I really appreciate all of you coming along and joining in here. What I want to do is I want to go through some of these. So a couple of people have suggested a couple here. Let me just look at some of these. Here we have got Romans 3 verse 25, which down here. And what we're looking at here is whom God put forward as a propitiation on account or through faith in him, by his blood, or by faith in his blood, for a demonstration of his righteousness at the present time, on account of the, let me rephrase that here, because in the forbearance of God, he has passed over the sins previously committed. Okay, so what we have here, let me have a look at we've got a change. We do have a couple of changes. You can see them quite clearly here. The key thing that's different between these two translations is that you don't have a sentence break here in the Greek. You don't have a sentence break here in the Legacy Standard Bible, but you do have a sentence break here in the New American Standard. Very interesting. So here, this is really, whom God displayed publicly as a propitiation in his blood through faith. So then you have to introduce a dummy subject to start a new sentence. This was to demonstrate his righteousness. Now, the problem with this in English, of course, is that it becomes a bit of a run-on sentence where you've got one thing after another that's kind of being added to the text here. But, of course, that's what's going on in the Greek text. Now, the challenge with any translation is going to be, do we require the more work of the reader, or do we make it easy for the reader? Another example of this, in fact, I think I might have even skipped over one or two that I might have been going to go through here. Yeah, I did. Let me show you another one here. Matthew chapter 6, verse 21. We see this in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21 and 22. I think I got that wrong. That should be chapter 5, I think it is. There it is. Yeah, this is what I wanted. So chapter 5. And so we've got here, whoever murders will be guilty before the court. And so here we have, this is an interesting one because here the New American Standard is actually a little more literal here. Liable he will be for judgment, essentially. Liable to be judged or to judgment. So in this one it's like he will be guilty, but liable is an older word, right? We don't really use that word very often, but it's more literal to what the Greek says. Guilty also works. It's okay, but then the court. This is really interesting. So on the one hand, judgment is really the meaning here, and I think if we look at we don't have a comment there. Okay, I thought we'd see a literal meaning of that. Literal meaning would be judgment. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, Raka. And here's another one where you've got the literal a rendering of the Aramaic directly, so again requiring more work of you as a reader than even the New American Standard, shall be guilty before the Sanhedrin, not the Supreme Court. Now again, most English translations, when they look at passages like this, they're going to make it easy for you as a reader to understand what's being said. And we understand Supreme Court, right? We're going to go to court, we're going to go to the highest court, and we're going to be judged there and in this case found guilty. Here, guilty before the Sanhedrin. Well, what's the Sanhedrin? And that's the challenge. So for people who are back in the first century who were Jewish, who will be reading this text, they would have no trouble understanding what the Sanhedrin was. But to a 21st century reader, and maybe not you or I who are on this call, but to someone who's reading the text for the first time, they're going to have no idea what a Sanhedrin is. And again, down the bottom, you see as we mouse over our little footnote, there's lots of references to the Sanhedrin, but no definition of the Sanhedrin. And I think this is one of those things that would be perhaps helpful. And we can see there in the New American Standard at the footnote down the bottom there, footnote number 3, literally the Sanhedrin. So they mention it in a footnote, but they leave in the text a modernized version. And this is one of the things we are seeing in the Legacy Standard Bible is demanding more from you as a reader. And there's a pro and a con there, right? Again, there's a benefit in doing this. So here's one of the challenges you sometimes find for missionaries. Let's say you go to, let's say you're going to go to Papua New Guinea or somewhere where they have no sheep, right? And then you come across this phrase, the Lamb of God, right? Who was slain for the sins of the world. How do you translate that and render it for the people who have never seen a sheep before and don't know what one is? Their staple food, their meat there is pig. Right? Are you going to translate it, behold the pig of God who was slain for the... That doesn't really work. And so you're going to have to make those kinds of decisions as a translator that are often very difficult because you're making compromises. And so one of the things that translators will have to do is to actually provide footnotes to explain the decisions that they've made. And this is where a lot of English readers really like the New English translation, the NET, which does a lot of these footnotes at the bottom of the page to explain the decisions that they've made. And so for somebody going back into some of those tribal situations, they have to do the same thing. Here for us in the 21st century, and particularly as English readers, we have a lot of resources available to us to help us to understand what we're reading and to dig in more detail. And in fact, one of the things I would look for pretty soon after this is released is there will probably be a MacArthur Study Bible version of this come out, which will probably be updated so that it takes some of these discussions into account. And I don't know for sure. I'm not, like I said, I'm not part of the translation team, or I'm not involved in any way, but I wouldn't be surprised to see something like that come out fairly soon afterwards. And I think then that what we see here is actually part of what we're looking at here. We're demanding more of the reader, and we're asking them to actually go back into the first century culture a little bit to understand what's going on there so that you get a better understanding of the text. And for what it's worth, this also provides the preacher with better material to work with, because as a preacher, you want to be able to teach and preach the Word of God as accurately as you can. And so if you have a very literal translation where it does require more of the reader, that also gives you more opportunity to teach and explain. And so for expository preachers, this then is gold, because if you're preaching from this and you're encouraging your congregation to work from it, you're going to ask them to go deeper into the Word than if they were just using an English translation that has a reading level of, say, a 9-year-old or an 11-year-old or 11th grade or whatever it happens to be. So this is just one of those things you see a lot in the Greek text, and so it's kind of interesting. Now I'm kind of wanting to wrap up. I didn't want to go too much over 45 minutes. So let us knock it off there, finish our time today there. I hope you've found this helpful. You know what? Someone just mentioned there, John 3:16. Yeah, let's do that. John 3 verse 16. Who was that? That was Preston. Thank you, Preston, for that. So here we go. For God so loved the world. So this is very traditionally rendered. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. And you can see from the lack of markings that this is no different to the New American Standard at all. Those are exactly the same rendering, which is both good and bad. So one of the things to be aware of here, for what it's worth, is that this word "so" in English is a little bit ambiguous. So a lot of translations and a lot of people, when they read this, they think that this means that, this is how much God loved the world. God loved the world so much that he gave his only begotten Son. But that's not what the Greek text here is saying. This little conjunction here, hautos, tells us the manner of God's love, not the extent of his love, but the means by which God demonstrates his love. So this is the manner in which God shows his love, so that, so as to send his only begotten, so as he gave his only begotten Son, in order that everyone who believes in him will not perish but may have eternal life. Okay, so this is a traditional rendering. It's not wrong, but you do need to be aware that this English word "so" is actually a little bit ambiguous, and you want to be aware that hautos is actually meaning in that, like, in this manner, right? Thus so, or in this manner is the standard gloss for hautos. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope you've really enjoyed the time we've spent together today. I've really enjoyed bringing it to you, and I appreciate you taking the time to hang out with me and talk through this. Personally, I really like this. I like this format too. It's kind of cute, don't you think? I really like this, and I think as a preacher's Bible, or even as a pew Bible, I think this would be a great translation. I would encourage pastors, especially if you don't know Greek, this would be a really good translation to work from as you go through and preach and teach the text, because it's going to demand more from you as a preacher and demand more from your readers as well, which will help you to get back to what's behind the English of the New Testament particularly, and hopefully the Old Testament when that comes out as well. So if this has been helpful, go ahead and hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you can see more videos just like this. And if you don't already have it, I would encourage you to go to masterntgreek.com/roadmap and download my roadmap, because what I do in that roadmap is give you a path to kind of be able to read through the whole of the New Testament in Greek. Now, not instantly, but over a few years, just learning how to do that so that you can look at text like what we see here and make these kinds of comparisons as well, and so that you can start to see the flow of the text, just like what we talked about in Galatians chapter 3. So again, thanks so much for joining me today. I look forward to sharing more with you in the next video. Until then, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery, and I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks very much. We'll see you in the next video.